Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
Are you ready for a shocking truth? For an entire year, I sent my parents $600 every single week without skipping once. And I did it because they told me that without my help they would lose their home after taking on a second mortgage to support my younger brother's endless business attempts. I did not argue. I did not calculate what I was giving up. I just started those weekly transfers, and I convinced myself that I was doing what any responsible daughter would do because I had a stable job, because I could spare the money, and because I thought that when the year was over I would feel appreciated and included in the family again. What actually happened is that 12 months later, after more than $30,000 had left my account, my dad looked at me with a straight face and said, "We didn't want you there." When I asked why I was left out of the family vacation they had planned with the same brother I had basically been bankrolling. That single sentence hit me harder than any overdraft notice or rejected payment ever had, because in that moment I realized they did not see me as a daughter who had sacrificed to keep them afloat. They saw me as someone convenient to drain until I became an inconvenience to their fun. I remember standing there in complete silence, while my mom muttered something about not wanting me to feel stressed on a trip, and my brother smirked like he had been given another medal for simply existing. I did not cry, I did not yell, I just stared, and inside me something very specific clicked into place. For months I had been repeating to myself that family comes first, that helping was worth it, that they would understand my value eventually. In that second, I understood that the only person who had not valued my own effort was me, and that was about to change. When I went home that evening, my fiancé Evan saw my face and did not even ask what happened. He simply pulled up the spreadsheet he had been quietly keeping because he said one day I would need to see the numbers lined up. There they were, 52 payments of $600 each, every single one labeled in the memo line with words like loan, mortgage help, or loan utilities, every single one documented in black and white. Evan pointed to the total and said softly, "Over 30,000, and not a single thank you trip, not even a dinner." I felt sick and furious at the same time, but mostly I felt stupid, because I had let it happen while telling myself it was temporary. I think he expected me to collapse, but instead I heard myself say, "I am not their ATM anymore." That night, instead of drafting a long dramatic message, I opened my banking app and I canceled the automatic bill pay I had set up that sent a portion of my paycheck straight into their account every Friday. I deleted the schedule, I deleted the reminder, and I sat back staring at the empty page like I had just unplugged a machine that had been running nonstop in the background of my life. Then, with a calm I did not recognize in myself, I typed a short text to my parents. "I'm pausing the weekly transfers while we sit down and talk about boundaries." I did not add a single extra word. The next morning, while they were already off on their vacation with my brother, the fallout began almost immediately. First, I started getting automated alerts from the shared phone plan, the one I was paying for because they had tied all their banking text codes and hotel confirmations to it. Then the unknown caller notifications lit up my screen one after another, followed quickly by my dad's number, and then my mom's number. I let it ring, I watched the screen vibrate, and I realized that for the first time in a year, I was not the one panicking about their bills. And that was only the beginning, because the moment I stopped feeding the machine broke down, and the first cracks were already showing before they had even finished their check-in at the hotel. Unknown caller again. Then another, then my dad's number, back to back. I set the phone down on the counter and just listened to the buzzing fill the room. I let it ring. By the time the fifth call came in, all from unknown numbers pinging one after the other in short, chaotic bursts, I already knew they were either standing at the hotel check-in desk dealing with a payment issue or realizing that their banking apps were no longer functioning the way they expected, because everything they'd lazily attached to the family phone plan I had been paying for, including two-factor authentication texts, flight confirmations, even the temporary hold they had placed on their home security system while traveling, was now either suspended or demanding credentials they no longer had access to. It wasn't vindictive. It wasn't revenge in the classic sense, and it wasn't meant to humiliate them. It was simply what happens when a system built on one person's silent cooperation starts to lose power, and that person finally, calmly pulls the plug. I didn't answer the first few calls, and I didn't answer the ones that came after either, because I knew full well that if I picked up now, I would hear the usual swirl of deflection, guilt-flipping, and carefully curated chaos meant to make me feel like the bad guy for setting a boundary that, frankly, should have been respected from the beginning. Instead, I waited until my phone buzzed again, this time with a voicemail from my mom, short, frantic, breathless, saying they were having trouble checking in and could I please call the front desk for them. She didn't mention the money, didn't mention the payments, didn't say anything about the text I'd sent the day before, just the hotel, just a small issue, just the assumption that I would still, somehow, solve the problem from a distance. So I didn't call the hotel. Instead, I opened my laptop, took a deep breath, and sent one email that changed everything. It was not dramatic, not angry, not even personal. I addressed it to my parents, CC'd my Aunt Teresa, who had always quietly kept track of the way things played out in our family, without stepping in unless absolutely necessary. And I attached a single PDF file that Evan had helped me format the night before. The file contained every single payment I had made over the past year, neatly itemized with dates, amounts, and most importantly, the memo notes that clearly marked them as loans: loan, mortgage help, loan, electric, loan, property tax, and so on. I included, in the body of the email, a simple note, attaching the record of weekly support for reference. We'll resume discussion when I return from my own plans. No rush. I didn't threaten anything. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't make a speech. I just sent receipts. Within minutes, Kyle replied, and I swear I could almost hear the indignation vibrating through the subject line alone. He launched into some nonsense about how family support doesn't need to be weaponized, and how money freely given isn't meant to be tallied like a spreadsheet, and how I was sour for expecting gratitude for something nobody asked for. That last part was what did it for me. Nobody asked for, because I had the email from my dad, dated exactly 1 year ago, in which he explained the second mortgage situation, told me not to tell Kyle because it might make him feel bad, and thanked me in advance for being the reliable one. I replied once, with that email, just forwarded in silence, and then I said nothing else. It was Teresa who stepped in next, replying to all, with one single line that cut through the entire mess like a knife through wet paper. So the vacation was booked while she was still paying your bills? Nothing else. No judgment, no sarcasm, just the question that made the entire setup look exactly as ridiculous as it was. There was no reply for hours after that, and when the next voicemail finally came in, this time from my dad, it was clipped, annoyed, and entirely void of the usual charm he reserved for manipulating a conversation to his side. He said, flatly, that I was making things complicated on purpose, and that he hoped I realized how ungrateful I was being. Ungrateful. That word, of all words, landed differently than he probably intended. Because I was sitting there with a full record of my generosity, a year of sacrificed weekends and skipped luxuries, just to keep them comfortable, just to keep the lights on, just to keep Kyle floating in whatever new project he was pretending to build. And in return, I was being told I wasn't wanted, I was difficult, I was ungrateful. That was the moment I realized I wasn't going to fix this with a heartfelt conversation or a teary-eyed intervention. I wasn't going to repair something that had never been equal to begin with. So I took the next step, not out of spite, not to hurt them, but to reinforce a boundary that had been invisible for too long. I opened the family phone plan, navigated to their 2 numbers, and I didn't delete or cancel them. I simply suspended international roaming access with a single click. That meant no verification texts from their bank, no check-in confirmations from the hotel, no notifications for their return flights. They could still call me, emergencies only, but they could no longer rely on the infrastructure I had built to quietly support every corner of their digital lives. Then I changed the voicemail greeting for their numbers to say, if you need to reach Maya, please text to schedule a time. She will respond when available. It was subtle. It was polite, and it made it clear that the days of instant access were over. And finally, I added one more message, this time directly to their hotel concierge, because my mom had forwarded me the booking confirmation weeks ago when she assumed I was coming too. I let them know that the card previously used for add-ons had been closed, and I recommended they check with the guests for an alternate form of payment. I didn't hear back for several hours. And then, just after midnight, Elaine sent a single message. They're asking for another card. We don't have one with space. Can we talk? I read it once. Then again. And all I said back was, that card is closed. Then I put my phone on airplane mode, turned it face down on the counter, and went asleep for the first time in what felt like months with a mind that wasn't racing, a jaw that wasn't clenched, and the kind of silence that doesn't demand to be fixed, only held. The following morning started without ceremony. No dramatic phone calls, no pleading voicemails, no desperate apologies waiting in my inbox, just the quiet hum of silence that somehow managed to feel even louder than all the noise that had come before it. I knew better than to believe it was over or that they had come to any grand realization overnight, because people like my parents don't reflect unless they're forced to, and even then, it's rarely because they want to understand your pain. It's because they've hit a wall and want you to build them a door. So while they were still stuck in their hotel, trying to maneuver their way out of a mess they never imagined they'd have to clean up themselves, I sat at our kitchen table with a cup of coffee, Evan's laptop, and a folder full of receipts that told the story they'd been trying to erase, line by line, transfer by transfer, every cent accounted for. I didn't want to fight. I didn't need revenge that left a scar. I wanted clarity. I wanted structure. And more than anything, I wanted to take something that had always been fuzzy, emotionally manipulative, and deeply unequal, and finally give it shape, something with terms, with consequences, and with a timeline that did not bend to guilt or tradition or some warped definition of what daughters owe their parents. That's when I started writing the proposal, not a letter, not a speech, just a clear and professional promissory note that outlined the total amount I had paid over the last year, the agreed-upon purpose of that money, and a proposed repayment schedule that wasn't cruel, wasn't rushed, but was firm enough to reestablish the fact that my help had never been a gift. And the idea that it had somehow been owed to them was nothing more than fiction they had told themselves to sleep at night. The note was 4 paragraphs long. It stated the exact amount, $31,200, to be repaid over 2 years in monthly installments that reflected both fairness and realism. It included a clause that if they failed to make 3 consecutive payments, the balance would be pursued through formal small claims court channels, and that if at any point Kyle attempted to contact me for money, directly or through them, the monthly payment would automatically increase by 5% as a breach of boundary penalty. I wasn't trying to be punitive. I was trying to break a cycle that had never once served me. Once the draft was ready, Evan helped me attach the spreadsheet of payments, the email from my dad thanking me for being the stable one, and a polite cover message that simply read, "Attached is a proposed repayment agreement, based on the support given between March of last year and March of this year. We'll proceed with small claims next Thursday if no agreement is signed. No further discussion until then." I sent it to my parents, CC'd only Evan this time, and didn't wait for a response, because for once, I wasn't operating from hope or desperation. I was operating from fact. A few hours passed before Kyle jumped in, and of course, he did so exactly the way I expected, condescending, patronizing, furious that I had brought anything legal into what he still considered a family matter. He wrote an email so smug I almost laughed reading it, filled with lines like, "You really think you're going to see your own parents, and this is why nobody trusts you, you're always looking for control." I replied once, just a single sentence that read, "You are not a party to this debt. Please do not contact me about it again." Then I blocked his email. It felt like brushing lint off my coat. By early evening, my mom replied careful, measured, pretending to be confused while trying to buy time. She asked if we could talk in person, if we could clear the air, and maybe find a more peaceful way to resolve things. I said I'd be happy to meet in person, with a notary present, to sign the agreement. She did not reply. So I did what they never expected. I sent a Google Calendar invite for the following Thursday titled Small Claims Filing, Bennett Loan Enforcement, and I shared it with both of them. I did not write a message. I just let the title speak for itself. Then I did one more thing, small, strategic, and completely within my right. I updated the shared family contact card in our group chat, the one we used for birthdays and announcements, and I attached the public view-only link to the spreadsheet of payments. No commentary. No caption. Just the cold truth laid bare for anyone in the family who wanted to understand why Maya had suddenly stopped showing up, stopped answering, stopped playing the role they had all quietly expected her to keep performing. I didn't care if it made them uncomfortable. I wasn't ashamed of the facts. I was done hiding behind politeness that only served to keep me exploited. Teresa called that night, not to scold, not to scaremonger, but to tell me, in her soft, steady voice, that she had known something wasn't right and that I had every right to protect myself. She also mentioned, casually, that Richard had a role on the social committee for their neighborhood community association, and that anything public, even small claims, would be messy for him. I thanked her. I didn't need leverage to hurt them. I just needed them to see that I had it and that I was no longer afraid to use it. The next morning, I got a text from my mom. It read, "We'll sign when we get back. Can you send the address for the notary?" I sent back a simple reply, Thursday. 2 p.m. Bring your IDs. Evan will be there. I didn't add a smiley face or a thank you or even a period. I just closed the thread, marked it archived, and set a reminder on my phone to print the documents the day before. I didn't feel powerful. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt level. Like for the first time in years, the ground under my feet wasn't shifting. And for once, I wasn't the one asking for solid footing, I was the one who had laid the foundation. When Thursday finally arrived, I didn't wake up with nerves or dread or even anticipation. Instead, I moved through the morning with the quiet certainty of someone who had already spent years paying the emotional tax of silence and had finally decided, with deliberate calm, to issue the invoice. There was no satisfaction in watching it all unfold, not in the way people imagine revenge brings some kind of euphoric closure, but there was, undeniably, a feeling of control that had long been absent from my life whenever it came to my parents. And I wasn't about to let sentimentality dismantle the structure I had spent the last week reinforcing with legal clarity and unwavering boundaries. They arrived at our place 10 minutes early, which was uncharacteristic enough that Evan and I exchanged a glance, because punctuality was never part of their dynamic unless it benefited them socially or financially. My mom walked in with that carefully cultivated expression she wore whenever she wanted to seem conciliatory without actually admitting wrongdoing, a face that said, "We're all just a little emotional, let's not make this bigger than it is." While my dad followed behind her, arms crossed, lips pressed tight, the tension in his jaw so visible it was practically vibrating off his skin. Kyle, of course, was there too, despite having no business being part of the conversation, and from the moment he crossed the threshold, he carried himself like someone about to hijack a meeting he wasn't invited to, eager to perform a role he had cast himself in, defender of family honor, even if he was the one bleeding it dry. We sat around the dining table, the documents neatly stacked in front of me, the notary already present and sipping tea in the corner like this was just another Thursday appointment. And I could feel the air tighten as my dad looked down at the first page of the agreement, the part that spelled out the $31,200 loan, the repayment terms, and the clause that outlined Kyle's prohibition from engaging me for financial assistance under any circumstance. He scoffed, a low dismissive sound that barely left his throat, and muttered something about bringing lawyers into family matters, but I didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't move. I just slid the pen across the table and waited. My mom, to her credit, didn't try to stall. She read the document line by line, hands slightly trembling, not, I think, from anger or shame, but from the slow dawning realization that the story she had been telling herself for a year, that I was strong enough to handle the burden, that Kyle just needed a little more time, that everything would balance out eventually, was nothing more than a comforting lie that crumbled the moment facts were laid down in black ink. She didn't argue. She just signed. My father, however, took a different route, as expected. He asked if we could talk outside, to which I said no, because everything needed to happen in writing with witnesses, in daylight. He said the interest rate I had suggested was insulting, even though it was lower than his own mortgage rate, and when I pointed that out, he said it wasn't about the money, it was about the principle. That was the moment I decided to play the final card I had kept in reserve, the voice memo. A few weeks earlier, before all of this had unraveled, I had recorded a casual conversation with my father, not because I was planning to use it, but because I had started documenting interactions when I realized how easily the facts got rewritten in our family. In the recording, he clearly said, "Don't tell Kyle you're helping us. He doesn't need to know we're relying on you right now." I had never played it for anyone. Until now. I pulled out my phone, hit play, and let the words fill the room. My dad's face didn't contort with guilt or embarrassment. It hardened, as if caught in a trap he still wanted to pretend didn't exist, and Kyle, hearing that sentence for the first time, turned sharply toward him, eyes narrowing in a way that suggested that for the first time in a long time, the golden boy wasn't sure where his place actually was. There was a silence, not long, but deep, and in that space, my dad reached for the pen. He signed without saying another word. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply thanked the notary, handed everyone their copies, and began the process of removing them from my digital infrastructure like a contractor deconstructing scaffolding no longer needed for a finished project. I logged into the phone plan, ported their numbers out, removed my credit card from every linked utility and service, sent them the how-to guides to manage things on their own, and created a final invoice for the first payment, due in 3 business days. It was only when Kyle began ranting, claiming I was trying to tear the family apart, that I was making this harder than it needed to be, and that I was playing victim while acting like a tyrant, that I looked him in the eye and said, with full composure, "You were never part of this agreement. You don't owe me anything, and I owe you nothing. If you contact me about money again, the penalty clause activates and the payment increases." He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. They left without ceremony. My mother glanced back once, as if expecting a last-minute reprieve or apology or some warm moment of reconciliation, but I didn't offer it. Not because I was cruel or unforgiving, but because I had finally accepted the truth that forgiveness without accountability is just surrender dressed in better words. And I had spent enough years waving white flags to people who didn't even know they were at war with me. That night, Evan and I didn't celebrate. We didn't toast or joke or talk about winning. We just sat on the couch, legs tangled together, and exhaled the kind of long, full breath that only comes when you've stopped treading water and finally found solid ground. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. And when my father texted, just before midnight, to say next month for the first payment, "We're tight this week," I sent one final reply, 3 days from now isn't a suggestion. It's in the contract. He didn't respond. But the next morning, the money was there. Every cent. After the first transfer came through full amount, on time, without commentary or disclaimers, I didn't feel vindicated or victorious or even especially relieved, because it wasn't about the money anymore and hadn't been for quite some time. It was about the acknowledgement that my boundaries were real, enforceable, and no longer subject to the fragile moods or fabricated emergencies of people who had mistaken my silence for permission for far too long. That morning, as the bank notification chimed softly on my phone and the deposit settled into the account I had created solely for repayment tracking, I didn't smile or sigh or even mark the moment with words to Evan. I simply glanced at the timestamp, made a note in the spreadsheet, and moved on, not out of coldness or detachment, but because I finally understood what it felt like to act from strength without needing it to be witnessed. Over the next few days, I dismantled what remained of the system I had quietly built to hold them up without recognition, a system that had stretched across utility payments, phone bills, calendar alerts, account reminders, auto-pay setups, and a dozen invisible ways I had been their safety net without ever calling it that. I logged into the phone plan, not to suspend them again, but to port their numbers to their own billing accounts, a process that required a few clicks and a final confirmation of separation. I removed myself from every utility dashboard, unsubscribed from bank notifications tied to their mortgage, deleted the emergency contact listings I had once filled out during their refinancing paperwork, and cleared out the document folders I had created just in case they ever asked me for help again. I didn't save backup copies. I didn't forward instructions. I didn't leave them breadcrumbs to find their way back to me. I walked out of that role like someone leaving a job she was never paid for, with a straight back and no need for applause. Evan, sensing the finality of the moment more clearly than I could articulate, suggested we take a weekend trip, nothing extravagant, just 2 nights away from the noise, somewhere quiet, just the two of us, no obligations, no shared data plans, no one else's needs intruding through the seams of my day. We used the points I had accumulated on a card I hadn't touched all year, points that had been slowly piling up while I paid for groceries I didn't eat, cable bills I didn't watch, and plane tickets I never used. The irony was not lost on me. I was finally using my own resources for myself, and I didn't feel guilty about it. Not even a little. We drove up to a cabin tucked away in the woods, the kind of place that doesn't ask for performance or polish, just your presence. I turned off my phone, dropped it in a drawer, and spent 48 hours waking up when my body wanted to, drinking coffee without rushing through the mug, and listening to the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but earned. There was no grand emotional purge, no teary-eyed breakdown, no cinematic collapse. Just rest. Just breath. Just space. When we got back, I found 2 unread texts from my father. The first said, "Loyalty means not embarrassing your family," and the second, sent 2 hours later, read, "I hope you're happy now." I didn't respond immediately, not because I was crafting a reply or trying to calculate the most devastating line, but because I needed to make sure I wasn't slipping back into the trap of managing his feelings while ignoring my own. The next morning, after breakfast, I opened my messages, typed slowly and deliberately, and sent back one sentence: "Loyalty without boundaries is just servitude in nicer clothes, and I'm done with that." There was no reply. Later that week, Teresa called, not to gossip or report or stir the pot, but simply to tell me, in her steady voice that always sounded like a truth left out in the sun to dry, that several family members had quietly reached out to her asking if what they saw in the spreadsheet was true, if I had really paid that much, if I had really been excluded, if I had really followed through without theatrics or explosions. She didn't defend me. She didn't excuse them. She just said, "They're finally asking the right questions." And, honestly, that was enough. I sent her a copy of the signed settlement agreement, not because she needed it, but because I wanted one person in the family to have it who wouldn't twist it, minimize it, or hide it in a drawer labeled drama. She said she'd keep it safe. In the months that followed, the payments continued to arrive, not early, never with a note, always exact. There were no calls, no holiday invitations, no surprise visits. The absence of chaos was louder than any apology could have been, and I learned how to live in that quiet, to trust it, to build something in it that didn't rely on pleasing people who only noticed me when I broke under the weight of their expectations. I didn't forgive them in the way people like to romanticize forgiveness. I didn't hug it out. I didn't write a letter. I didn't sit across from them at a table asking for shared accountability. I forgave them by no longer needing them to change for me to be okay. And as for the money, I still have every receipt. I keep the spreadsheet, not to punish myself with memory, but as a monument to the moment I stopped bleeding out for people who treated my generosity like oxygen they didn't have to pay for. I look at it sometimes, not out of anger, but to remind myself what it looks like when the line finally gets drawn, not with fire or rage or some climactic scream, but with a quiet, deliberate decision to stop paying for access to people who wouldn't lift a finger if the roles were reversed. I didn't torch the bridge. I just installed a toll. And now, every time they try to cross, they remember, I own the booth.